Hello everyone, welcome back. So in this video we're going to talk about Chapter 2 from the Helicopter Flying Handbook. Now this chapter is all about aerodynamics. So as I said in the previous video, what we're not going to do is we are not going to rehash everything that's in the Rod Machado book. So Rod has quite a bit of information on aerodynamics, and the parts that are shared with airplanes, we're not going to emphasize. We're just going to talk about what's different with helicopters, and that alone is a lot to talk about because helicopters are kind of very different animals from airplanes. So, if you look at a helicopter, it has the same four forces acting on it in flight. We have lift, weight, drag, and thrust. And we can break up those forces. We have lift from the rotors. Now, the rotors might be tilted forward, as it is here in this picture in forward flight. So the thrust is tilted forward, but you can resolve that force into two components. There's the part that's opposing the weight, which is here, and then there's the part that is propelling you forward, and that is the thrust that goes this way. And that is opposed by the drag of the helicopter that goes the other way. So helicopter, airplane still have the same fundamental four forces acting on them. Now, of course, here they talk about things like Bernoulli's principle. Again, not going to rehash that. It's the same. Bernoulli's principle doesn't change when you go from an airplane to a helicopter. It just gets cooler because everything is cooler with helicopters. So when you look at drag, and again, they can break it down to different kinds of drag. You have things like form drag. If you take a plate and you try to slam it through the air, you get a bunch of turbulent flow. If you have something like a sphere, it gets a little bit better. And if you put a fairing on that sphere, it gets better yet. And if you have a sphere inside a little kind of eye-shaped housing, then it gets even better yet. So those are examples of form drag. We have different kinds of drag. We have induced drag, which is created when it creates a lift. It has to necessarily create some drag. We talk about total drag just like we do with airplanes. Talk a little bit about airfoils. Now, one thing that's different between an airplane and a helicopter is the types of airfoils we tend to have. What do the wings look like versus what does a rotor look like? And here's a little picture about the induced drag. So we've got the lift that's being produced because we tilted this airfoil up. We increased that angle of attack that Rod will talk about. And we have the part of this lift that's vertical, and then the part of it that's tilted backwards. So again, here's our total lift. We resolve it into components. And we got the vertical part and then the backward part, and that's the drag part. We can look at our total drag where we add up parasite drag, which is from, dragging stuff through the air, profile drag, and then induced drag. So as we go slower, the induced drag goes up, and as we go faster, the parasite drag goes up. We add all those together, we get a curve kind of like this. And then we have this minimum point, which we sometimes called LD max. This is the most efficient point for an aircraft because we have the least amount of drag for the speed. And that's going to be in a very different place from a helicopter to the airplane. Right? Airplanes, at least small airplanes, typically have a non-symmetrical airfoil. What does that mean? At zero angle of attack, this thing will still make lift because the path over the top is bigger than the path over the bottom. Helicopters typically, but not always, have symmetrical airfoils, just like jets do. So if there's no angle of attack here, then there's no lift being produced. So if you have your rotors spinning, but the rotors are flat, it doesn't produce any lift. You're never going to leave the helipad, is basically what that means. There are a couple helicopters out there that you can get asymmetrical blades. Some of the home builts, like the rotorways, there was an option. And today, some people really seek out those blades because they're supposedly better for things like auto rotations. I don't know, because I haven't actually flown them personally, but I have no reason to disbelieve the people that like them. And we will look at blades just like you have with a prop. You're going to have blade twist. So you're going to have a varying angle of attack as you go outward on your blade. And why is that? Well, that's because the tips are moving a lot faster, so they're getting a lot more wind than the inner parts of the blade. So you need to kind of wash out the angle of attack, if you will. Otherwise, you would have a ton of lift being produced at the tips and nothing in the middle. And that's inefficient, and it might also cause a failure of those rotor blades because you have all this leverage and you're really torquing those things and they're going to try to snap on you. So here, if you look at a cross section of a blade, here in close to the center, you'll notice that the angle of incidence is higher. We call it angle of incidence because angle of attack is relative to the air hitting you, and angle of incidence is relative to the plane that this thing rotates in. The tip path plane is what we call it. And then that goes down a little bit as we go toward the middle, and then it gets almost completely flat near the end. And why do we do that? Well, if you look at a rotor that's spinning out here near the tip, I've got a 387 knot wind. I got a 290 knot wind, 183 knot wind, and a 96 knot wind. If I look at my lift being produced, my lift is proportional to my speed squared. So I've got this speed that is 4 times this speed. So I'm going to produce 16 times the lift here that I'm going to produce here unless I do something different. And again, that's a lot of stress. And this guy's not doing a lot. It also affects my drag. We talked about that as well. So if you look at a helicopter, we have what we call induced flow. This rotor is sucking air down through it. So if I'm just going straight up or hovering in the air out of ground effect, the airflow is going to look kind of like this. When I'm hovering, you'll see the velocities. They're going to change a lot. As I get closer to the tip, it's going to be strongest. Makes sense. This is going faster, producing more lift, so it's going to have more of a downwash. All right. So what happens in forward flight? We start moving and we kind of change the equation a little bit. So as we start moving, now we've got horizontal airflow. So we have that induced flow that's sucking the air down, but we have air going more horizontal into our blades. So if you look at this picture, you'll see, all right, here's my angle of attack. And then I have my induced flow loss, if you will, right? That sucking down the air reduces the angle that I'm going to feel on the rotor blade. And this is my new relative wind, right? So here's the rotative relative wind. That's just from having this thing rotate in the air. And then that effect is decreased a little bit by this induced flow effect. What happens if you look at the aft portion of the rotor blade, the induced flow is stronger. And why is that? Well, look at the blades. This is somewhat exaggerated, but this one is at a lower angle to the wind, right? Whereas here, if you just said, I'm going to have the wind go straight, it's just glancing along the top of this guy, and it's going to go through this guy in a downward fashion. Now, of course, it's going to get sucked down a little bit as well. So now you have this increased flow, this induced flow, which has the effect of reducing the angle of attack. When the angle of attack goes down, what happens? You produce less lift. So you're going just a few knots. What can happen is it's going to say, oh, well, I'm more efficient here and less efficient there. So it's going to try to tip up on you. And this is one of many effects that you get with a helicopter. Now, if I try to hover a helicopter, we talk about in-ground effect and out-of-ground effect hovers. So with in-ground effect, it is just like an airplane where the ground interferes with this induced flow, if you will. So here we have the air being sucked down in. And we have these tip vortices, just like we have with an airplane wing. As you get closer to the ground, it's going to channel this air. So it's going to be less downward and more outward. So it's going to start going out kind of like this and not just straight down. And that has an effect of reducing the induced flow and therefore increasing the angle of attack. So what's the net of that? You basically have this cushioning effect, just like you do with a plane. So you can hover with a lot less power in ground effect. Now, when you start going out of ground effect, what's going to happen? Well, now, instead of having the air come and be deflected, if you will, it's going to come straight down. So it's going to increase that angle of attack. Decrease the angle of attack. and you're not going to be as efficient. So if you look at a helicopter, it's going to have an in-ground effect hover ceiling and an out-of-ground effect hover ceiling. Above that point, you can't hover it. All right, angle of attack, that's the same thing as for airplanes. When you look at different kinds of flight, powered flight, we have hovering flight, vertical flight, forward flight, sideways, rearward flight, which we typically try to avoid for a couple of reasons. Yes, you can back up a helicopter, but you can't see very well. And there's a spinny tail rotor back there, and that's not good. So hovering flight, how does that work? Well, very carefully. As someone very correctly said, in a helicopter, everything depends on everything. So if you look at a helicopter in a hover, you've got equilibrium, right? These four forces of flight are equalizing each other. So the thrust equals the drag, and the lift equals the weight. And you have to have enough power to overcome all of the drag in everything. You've got a couple of rotors spinning up, there's transmissions, and, all of that. And let's say you start to drift one way, well, then you put in some controls to stop the drift. Well, very easily, you just change the equation. So you demanded maybe more power from the engine by doing that. Now you're descending. Oh, you have to increase the power then. Oh, sorry, you increase the power, you change the torque. So now you have to change the pedal. And you can very easily get into a situation where you're just chasing this. It's part of the reason that helicopters are a lot more challenging. It's definitely in the hover. It's not unusual for someone to take, 8 or 10 hours to kind of get this hover thing and how it works. When you are flying in a helicopter in a hover, you have this thing called translational tendency or drift. And what is that? Well, if I look at a typical helicopter from above, the blades are spinning this way, counterclockwise. So I'm going to have a tail rotor on the left side of the tail, and it produces thrust toward the right. Well, in a hover, what's going to happen? This is counteracting the rotation of the blade. So, this is a torque to counteract this torque. Oh, that's great. But I'm also producing a sideways thrust. And if I don't correct anything, that's going to cause the helicopter to drift to the right. So how do I fix that? I can do things like tilt the rotor to the left. And depending on the helicopter, this might be done for me. And here in the book, they talk about different ways that this can happen. You put a slight angle in the rotor. You can rig the flight control a certain way. You can set up the transmission a certain way. You can tilt the whole fuselage. And then there's the Robinson way. Helicopter pilot has to fix it. Other things that can happen with a helicopter that not so much in an airplane, pendular action. So pendular action. You have this helicopter, you have this big rotating disc, and you have a weight hanging from it. So essentially, this helicopter pivots around this point here at the top of the mast. And what do you call it when you have a pivot point and then you have some weight below it? That's a pendulum. So if you get too crazy on the controls, you can get into a place where this thing is oscillating back and forth. And this is an effect that you can notice. Other things you'll notice with a helicopter, we have coning. What's coning? As you increase the collective and produce more thrust off of this main rotor, the ends are going to curl up because you're producing lift and you still have centrifugal force that's trying to pull these blades apart, but now you have lift. So the resulting force is kind of angled upward. And that's why a rotor will cone. And you'll notice this most importantly when you take off. So if you're watching this from the side, you'll see how this is going to say, oh, well, I'm coning up because you're demanding more from me, basically. Other things that we talk about with helicopters, we have Coriolis effect, also known as the law of conservation of angular momentum. They talk about the typical ice skater. They start spinning slowly, and then they bring their arms in, and they speed up. And why is that? Because they are they're conserving their angular momentum, but they brought all the weight in toward the middle. So now they have to speed up their rotation to counteract that and to keep everything constant. Well, the same thing happens with this rotor blade, right? I'm pulling the weight in when it cones, and that's going to cause it to want to speed up. Other things that can happen, we have what's called gyroscopic precession. Well, what is that? What that is, whenever you have a rotating thing, which we call a gyroscope, if you apply a force one place, you feel it 90 degrees later in the direction of rotation. So if I apply a force here to the right, it's actually felt in the front. So if I say, hey, I'm going to tilt the disc to the right because I want to go that way, and I apply this force, all of a sudden the nose tucks under. And that is gyroscopic precession. And the people that design rotors and rotorcraft know that that's going to happen. So, the controls are rigged appropriately. Okay, so what about, forward flight? As you go forward, now things really get interesting. A couple of things are going to happen. So here it says, as each blade passes the 90 degrees position on the left in a counterclockwise rotation blade system, the maximum increase in angle of attack occurs. All right, so here, as I come around, I'm producing less lift. So my angle of incidence is going to go down. And then that force is felt 90 degrees later with an upward deflection of my rotor. And then here I have the angle of attack increased, and that is felt 90 degrees later, so I get the maximum downward deflection of my rotor. And if you're having a hard time with this, ask questions in class about it. I know this is pretty complicated stuff. All right, so here we are in a hover with no wind. It's somewhat simple. And how do we go from this situation to forward flight? Well, we tilt the rotor blade forward. So we tilt that lift, if you will. It's called the resultant force here, but it's really the force you're getting from that rotor blade. We tilt it forward. Now we have thrust and lift. And the lift opposes the weight, and then the drag opposes the thrust. So if I tilt forward and I don't change anything else, the helicopter is going to sink because I don't have as much force to oppose the weight. The helicopter didn't suddenly get lighter. So that's something I need to account for in a helicopter. Other things that happen in helicopters. And I look at the airflow, the advancing blade, basically the right side here, has a higher airspeed than the other blade. Retreating blade is what we call it. So here they're saying, all right, you're going 120 knots. So the relative wind from the aircraft movement here is 120 knots. And for this guy, it's 120 knots, but it's behind, it's going away from the rotor. So what's going to happen? The left side produces less lift. So if I have a blade and the tips are moving at 400 knots and I'm going 100 knots forward, this has 500 knots of wind at the tip at this 90 degree point. And here I have 300 knots of wind because I have 400 minus 100, not plus 100. And remember again that the lift produced is proportional to the speed squared. So what's going to happen if I'm not careful? I'm going to run into a limitation of a helicopter. Now, one of the limitations is retreating blade stall. So, what happens there? I go so fast that the airspeed gets really low here, and that airfoil is going to stall, and the helicopter is going to try to roll over. So this is going to try to roll to the left. Now we just talked about gyroscopic precession. So if I apply this downward force here, it's going to be felt 90 degrees later, and the nose is going to tuck. Well, tuck up in this case. But, those are the kinds of things that happen in a helicopter. So how do we keep that from happening? Well, there's a couple of things we do. The helicopter blades are allowed to flap. There's a flapping hinge in most blades, and that's going to go up. So here at point A, we have the up flap velocity, and that is going to reduce our angle of attack. Our relative wind comes at a less of an angle, which means less lift. Here, we're going to flap down because we're producing less lift, And that increases this angle of attack. If you want to think of it this way, the wind is kind of hitting it from the bottom now. And then, of course, we have the in-between states. So as you're starting out, you start from a hover, you push forward, the helicopter's going to try to sink. So, you need to have to increase the power, increase the collective so that doesn't happen. And then as you speed up, you're going to get what we call blowback. So what's blowback? That's the rearward tilting of this disc. And there's a couple of things that cause that. For one, we already saw the pictures of what's the induced flow look like as you go into forward flight. There's another factor or two coming into play here. As you're going forward, this forward part of the disc is starting to get into clean air, whereas it's throwing all of its turbulence into the back part of the disc. So it's not going to produce as much lift. So you'll notice when you go to take off in a helicopter that it's going to try to pitch up or blow back on you, and you have to push through it, push forward. And you have to get to what we call translational lift. So as you speed up, you get better and better lift. We call it translational lift because the air is going more horizontally through the rotor and less vertically. And we talk about ETL, effective translational lift. So that's a speed. And above that, you will get a noticeable improvement in performance. Above this speed. It's usually 16 to 24 knots. And what happens at this speed? You completely outrun your turbulence. So here we're going at like 1 to 5 knots. Even just 1 knot is an improvement over hovering. And look at these vortices. I mean, yeah, it's starting to get a little better, right? It's not quite as vertical through the rotor in the front. It's still kind of vertical in the back. And then as we speed up, we have this tip vortice at the tip of my rotor here. But see how much more of this flow is horizontal or translational, if you will, than what I had here. And then as I increase the speed a little bit more, then I get to my ETL speed. And now it's all outrunning all that horrible turbulent air. Now you can detect this in a helicopter. You can sometimes hear it or feel it, or there might be a little bit of a shudder. Now, you might not notice it so much when you're taking off because you'll go through this pretty quickly, but you might notice it on landing a lot. So that is translational lift and ETL. So there's a couple of phases. You start in a hover, you start pushing forward a little bit. When you push forward, you might have a little translating tendency. So it might try to pitch up with that blowback, and it might also try to roll you to the right. So there's a couple of things you're going to have to do. And just like flying an airplane, I can talk to you all day long about here's what you have to do here and here's what you have to do there. The reality is you will probably just very quickly, instinctually fix these things. You're going this way. Okay, well, push the stick the other way. You can have sideward flight. One of my favorite things to do when I have an airplane pilot in a helicopter is taxi sideways or backwards. It just feels wrong, but you can certainly do it. And, there's basically no limit to which way you can go in a helicopter. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about sideways flight and rearward flight. You can go through that in the book. Turning flight, pretty much the same as for an airplane. If you want to turn to the right, you push the stick to the right, tilts the rotor disc, tilts the lift, if you will. And of course, you might have to counter that with some pedal, just like you would in an airplane. And then the more you bank, the more you increase your stall speed for those blades, but it's usually not near the factor in a helicopter that it is with a plane, right? Because the rotors are spinning already. So what do you do if your engine fails in a helicopter? Well, you do something called an auto rotation. And how is this allowed to happen? It's allowed to happen because there is an automatic mechanism where if the engine speed is less than the rotor speed that's going into the transmission at least, it will disengage the engine from the rotors. And this will allow you to continue to fly your helicopter. So if I look at normal powered flight, I'm sucking air down through this rotor. If I look at auto rotation flight, instead of sucking air down, I have air pushing up through the rotor, causing it to spin. Now, because the main rotor is connected to the tail rotor through a transmission, I'm allowed to control the aircraft as I come down. So, as I said before, statistically, you're better off in a helicopter with an engine failure than you are in an airplane. And part of the reason for that is you can land with nearly zero vertical speed and horizontal speed in a very small place. Now, the downside is you're not going to have your choice of places. Because if you lose your engine in a typical small helicopter, you're going to be coming down at 1,500 to 2,000 feet per minute. So if you started at 500 feet, you're going to be on the ground in about 20 seconds. So it's not going to be a long event, which I guess is good and bad. You have less time to screw it up. And if you screw it up, you have less time to contemplate what you just did. So in an auto rotation, what happens is the air is coming up through the rotor. So typically, you would drop the collective control, which I realize we haven't talked about yet in detail, and flatten out these blades so that they can spin. And you have in the middle what we call the stall region. This stuff is going so slow. Nothing's really happening here. This airfoil is stalled out. And then we have the driving region. This driving region is causing this thing to turn. And then out at the tips, we have the driven region. This is producing that little bit of lift that you're getting. So, it's roughly 30% that are actually doing anything. And a big chunk of this isn't doing anything for you. But hey, it's still spinning, so we're good. And how do you adjust the RPMs? Well, you change the pitch, which changes the different regions that we have here. Now, of course, this changes a little bit if we start talking about forward flight. And here there's this picture, and it's talking about vertical auto rotation flight. And again, here we have the driven region. What are the forces? We have the aerodynamic force that is tilted backward. So it's producing some drag. And then we have lift that opposes the weight. Then we have this equilibrium point where everything is, going to even out. And if I look at this region C, the driving region, this total aerodynamic force is tilted forward a little bit. And so that is causing this thing to want to turn. And then, of course, the stall region, there's not any lift being produced here. So it's nothing but drag. It does absolutely nothing for you. Now, if you're in forward flight, all that happens is that these little circles get shifted out toward the retreating blade. So now, you've got a thicker driven region on this side and a thinner driven region on this side, because everything's been shifted over. And there's, if you get into the details of the aerodynamics of auto rotations, there are literally entire books on that. There's a book called The Little Book of Auto Rotations, which is a great read. If you want to know more about that book or some other books, ask me about it in class. But, those are the basics of helicopter aerodynamics. And that's just the parts that are different from airplanes. Which brings us to the end of this chapter and the end of this video. So that's all for this chapter, and we will see you in class.